As the world grows quiet and the noise of the day finally loosens its grip, something profound happens. Night is not merely the absence of light, it is a doorway. Throughout history, God has met his servants in the stillness, when distractions fade and the soul is exposed. Before you sleep, you are standing at the edge of that doorway. What you carry into it matters. The mind does not power down simply because the body lies still. Thoughts linger, regrets whisper, fears replay, and Scripture reminds us that while we sleep, the unseen realm does not. This is why the final words you speak before rest are not trivial, they are directional. Prayer before sleep is not a habit for the religious. It is a strategic act of alignment. You are, in that moment, releasing control. You are admitting that tomorrow is not yours to manage, nor was today yours to perfect. You are placing your consciousness, your vulnerability, and even your dreams into hands far more capable than your own. This prayer is not long. It is not poetic. It is deliberate. Before you sleep tonight, you are choosing who stands watch over your soul. Nightfall has always marked more than the closing of a day. It signals a transition between realms of attention. When the sun sets and activity slows, the defenses of the human heart relax. The mind, no longer distracted by motion and noise, becomes contemplative, whether it intends to or not. This is why the quiet hours have carried such weight throughout Scripture. It is not coincidence that God so often speaks in the stillness. The night strips life down to essentials, and what remains is the truth we avoid during the day. In daylight, we manage appearances. We answer demands, solve problems, and convince ourselves we are in control. But as darkness settles, control proves illusory. You cannot command sleep. You cannot silence memory. You cannot schedule peace. The night exposes dependency, and that exposure is not weakness, it is invitation. You are standing at a threshold where the visible world loosens its grip and the invisible presses nearer. What you choose to do in that moment determines what governs your inner life. The soul is particularly receptive at night because resistance is low. Fatigue humbles the intellect. Emotion rises closer to the surface. This is why anxiety often intensifies after dark, why regrets grow louder, and why fear prefers midnight conversations. Yet this same vulnerability makes night a sacred opportunity. The heart unguarded is more capable of alignment. Prayer at this hour is not forced. It is natural. It meets the soul where it already is, aware of its limits. Throughout history, night has been associated with watchfulness. Shepherds kept watch by night. Guards stood alert while others slept. In spiritual terms, the question is always the same. Who is watching over you when you are not conscious? Before sleep, you are preparing to disengage from awareness. That act alone is a declaration of trust. You are saying, whether intentionally or not, that you believe the universe will hold together without your supervision. This is why prayer before sleep carries such weight. It is not merely reflection on the day past. It is preparation for a temporary surrender of consciousness. You are handing over your thoughts, your defenses, and your awareness to forces beyond your control. If you do not do this deliberately, something else will gladly assume the role. The night does not remain neutral. It is either entered with intention or filled by whatever lingers unresolved. There is a reason the final thoughts of the day often shape dreams and moods upon waking. The mind continues its work long after the body rests. Prayer at night establishes boundaries. It frames the threshold so that what crosses into the inner life is filtered through trust rather than fear. This is not superstition, it is design. Human consciousness was never meant to operate independently of its creator, especially when it is most unguarded. When you pray before sleep, you are acknowledging that life is not sustained by effort alone. You are admitting that rest itself is an act of faith. To sleep is to believe you will awaken. To pray before sleep is to believe you will awaken with purpose intact. You are not escaping the world. You are placing it in proper order. Night also compresses perspective. Problems that seemed manageable during the day can feel overwhelming in the dark. This is because night removes the illusion of scale. It reminds you that you are small, and that is precisely where truth begins. Prayer at this threshold restores proportion. It reminds the soul that it is not the axis upon which reality turns. The doorway of night is crossed every day, yet rarely honored. When entered carelessly, it becomes a breeding ground for unrest. When entered deliberately, it becomes a sanctuary. Before you sleep, you are not merely ending a day, you are positioning your soul, and the posture you choose at that threshold echoes far beyond the night itself. Prayer was never intended to be a performance or a formula. It is not a ritual designed to impress heaven, nor a checklist to soothe religious conscience. At its core, prayer is alignment. It is the deliberate act of bringing the inner life into agreement with truth. Before sleep, this alignment becomes especially critical because the will is yielding control and the mind is transitioning from activity to rest. What is out of order during the day rarely resolves itself at night unless it is intentionally placed back into alignment. Most people approach prayer as a means of requesting outcomes. They bring a list of needs, concerns, and desires, hoping that articulation alone will produce change. Yet the deeper purpose of prayer is not to inform God, but to reorder the one who prays. Before sleep, the question is not what you want tomorrow to look like, but who you are allowing to govern your thoughts when your guard is down. Alignment determines governance. The human mind is constantly forming patterns. Throughout the day, it absorbs information, emotion, and reaction. Much of this accumulation is contradictory. You can believe one thing intellectually and live another emotionally. Sleep does not correct this imbalance. It amplifies whatever has been left unresolved. Prayer before sleep becomes the final act of calibration. It is where the soul says, "This is the truth I choose to stand on, regardless of how the day felt." Alignment requires honesty. It means acknowledging where fear has displaced trust, where resentment has taken root, where pride has masked insecurity. This is not confession for the sake of guilt. It is confession for the sake of clarity. When these distortions are ignored, they follow the mind into rest and shape the subconscious. When they are named and released, the mind is freed to rest without tension. The will also requires alignment. Throughout the day, the will is pulled in competing directions: responsibility, desire, obligation, distraction. By nightfall, it is fragmented. Prayer gathers the will back into coherence. It is the moment when scattered intentions are brought under a single authority. This is why short, sincere prayers at night often carry more power than elaborate ones spoken at other times. The soul is tired of pretending. It is ready for truth. Alignment before sleep is not passive resignation. It is active trust. You are not saying that nothing matters. You are saying that ultimate control does not belong to you. This distinction is crucial. Many confuse surrender with apathy, but true surrender sharpens awareness. It places concern where it belongs and removes it from where it does harm. When the soul is aligned, rest becomes possible without anxiety. The spirit, too, requires alignment. If the inner life has been neglected, sleep becomes shallow and unrestful. This is not merely psychological. Humans were designed as integrated beings. When the spiritual dimension is ignored, imbalance manifests elsewhere. Prayer before sleep reconnects the soul to its source. It reestablishes relationship rather than transaction. Alignment does not always feel dramatic. Often it is quiet, even unsatisfying to the emotional appetite, but its effects are cumulative. Night after night, aligning the mind, will, and spirit produces stability that no external circumstance can provide. You begin to wake not because problems have vanished, but because perspective has been restored. In this sense, prayer before sleep is preventative rather than reactive. It addresses disorder before it hardens into anxiety or despair. It is a discipline of maintenance, not repair. The soul, like any complex system, functions best when regularly recalibrated. When you approach prayer as alignment, you stop measuring its effectiveness by immediate outcomes. Instead, you notice a deeper consistency emerging. The day no longer dictates your inner state as easily. Rest becomes deeper. Fear loses its authority. This is not because life has grown simpler, but because the soul has found its proper orientation before entering the vulnerable hours of rest. Silence has a way of revealing what noise conceals. When the world settles into darkness and activity ceases, the unseen does not become inactive. It becomes more apparent. Scripture repeatedly implies that there is more occurring around us than our senses detect, and the night, by its very nature, strips away the illusion that the visible world is all there is. This is why the quiet hours have so often been associated with vigilance, testing, and spiritual conflict. Not because darkness is evil in itself, but because it removes distractions that keep deeper realities at bay. During the day, the mind is fortified by movement and engagement. Decisions are made quickly, problems are compartmentalized, and threats are managed through action. At night, these defenses lower, fatigue weakens resolve, imagination becomes more active, memories surface without invitation. This shift creates an environment where unresolved fears and doubts gain volume. It is not that new battles begin at night, it is that existing ones are no longer hidden. The unseen struggle is not always dramatic or overt. It often manifests as subtle erosion, doubt replacing confidence, anxiety distorting perspective, accusation replaying past failures. These are not random mental events. They follow predictable patterns, intensifying when the mind is least guarded. The night becomes a proving ground, not because it introduces danger, but because it exposes what has not been addressed. Spiritual opposition rarely announces itself with clarity. It thrives in ambiguity, suggestion, and repetition. A thought entertained long enough begins to feel like truth. Before sleep, the mind is particularly susceptible to this process. Without deliberate intervention, whatever narrative has gained momentum during the day is carried forward unchecked. This is why prayer before sleep is not symbolic, it is strategic. To pray at night is to acknowledge that vigilance does not end when consciousness fades. It is an admission that protection is needed precisely because awareness is about to be surrendered. This is not fear-driven thinking, it is realism. No commander leaves a post undefended simply because the troops are tired. Rest requires trust, but trust is not blind. It is placed wisely. The idea of spiritual conflict unsettles many because it challenges the notion of neutrality. Yet neutrality is a luxury the night does not afford. When the mind drifts, something will fill the space. When attention loosens, influence increases. Prayer before sleep establishes authority over that space. It declares that the coming hours are not unclaimed territory. This does not mean the believer should lie awake in vigilance or suspicion. On the contrary, true preparedness produces peace. When boundaries are set, rest follows naturally. The purpose of acknowledging the unseen battle is not to create anxiety, but to remove it by placing responsibility where it belongs. The night also magnifies truth. Just as fear grows louder in silence, so does assurance when it has been deliberately affirmed. Prayer anchors the mind to what is known rather than what is imagined. It interrupts the cycle of rumination and replaces it with resolve. In doing so, it deprives fear of its most effective weapon, unchecked repetition. There is also a forward-looking aspect to this moment. Night is not only about protection from what lurks in darkness, it is preparation for what follows morning. The state in which you enter sleep often determines the clarity with which you awaken. A mind left entangled in conflict does not reset overnight. A mind placed under authority does. Spiritual battles are not always won through confrontation. Many are won through positioning. Before sleep, positioning takes the form of surrender, trust, and deliberate alignment with truth. You are not engaging every thought. You are choosing which thoughts are allowed to remain. When this becomes a habit, the night loses its power to intimidate. Silence no longer feels threatening. Darkness becomes restful rather than oppressive. This transformation does not occur because the unseen world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. Before sleep, you are making a declaration, whether spoken or unspoken, about who holds authority when you do not. Prayer makes that declaration explicit. It turns a vulnerable moment into a fortified one, not through effort, but through trust placed where it was always meant to rest. Every day leaves residue, conversations unfinished, words spoken too sharply, opportunities missed, fears indulged, hopes deferred. By the time night arrives, the soul is carrying more weight than it was designed to hold. Much of this weight goes unnoticed during the day because motion distracts us from it. But when the body slows and the lights dim, the burden asserts itself. Regret becomes vivid, anxiety sharpens, the mind begins to rehearse what cannot be changed. This is the moment when surrender is no longer theoretical but necessary. Surrender before sleep is not an admission of defeat, it is an act of wisdom. There are things that cannot be resolved by thinking harder or trying longer. The night makes this clear. You cannot fix tomorrow by replaying today. You cannot rewrite conversations by reliving them. Yet the human mind persists in trying, exhausting itself in cycles of self-accusation and worry. Prayer interrupts this cycle by redirecting responsibility. To surrender is to place what you cannot carry into hands capable of bearing it. This includes fear of the unknown, regret over the past, and anxiety about outcomes you cannot control. These are not small matters, but they were never meant to be processed alone. Before sleep, the soul is most honest about its limits. That honesty becomes the doorway through which surrender enters. Unfinished burdens have a particular power at night. They demand resolution when none is possible. This is why sleep can feel elusive even when the body is exhausted. Prayer does not magically resolve every issue, but it reframes them. It declares that resolution does not depend solely on your vigilance. This shift is not psychological trickery, it is alignment with reality. Fear is often rooted in imagined futures. Regret is anchored in irreversible pasts. Both thrive in isolation. When they are held internally, they grow disproportionate to their actual scope. Surrender externalizes them. It places them in a context larger than the self. In doing so, their power diminishes, not because they vanish, but because they are no longer the ultimate authority. There is also a moral dimension to surrender. It involves releasing the need to justify oneself, to be right, or to be in control. Pride resists this release even when exhausted. Prayer before sleep gently dismantles that resistance. It invites the soul to rest without defense. This is not humiliation, it is relief. Many struggle with surrender because they equate it with passivity. In truth, surrender requires discernment. It involves identifying what is beyond your control and consciously releasing it. This act clarifies what remains within your responsibility. By letting go of what you cannot manage, you become more capable of addressing what you can when morning comes. The act of surrender also prepares the soul for forgiveness, both given and received. Unresolved resentment is a heavy burden to carry into rest. It keeps the mind alert and the heart guarded. Prayer before sleep opens the possibility of release, not because the wrongs no longer matter, but because they are no longer allowed to govern the inner life. Surrender does not eliminate consequences or responsibilities. It reorders them. It places ultimate authority where it belongs and frees the soul from pretending to be its own savior. This freedom is essential for rest. Sleep is not merely physical recovery, it is a rehearsal of trust. When surrender becomes habitual at night, the soul develops resilience. Problems are still encountered, but they do not colonize the inner life. Regret is acknowledged without becoming identity. Fear is recognized without becoming prophecy. This stability does not arise from denial, but from proper placement of burdens. Before sleep, surrender is the final task of the day. It is the moment when you acknowledge that you have done what you could and release what you could not. In doing so, you create space for rest that is not haunted by unfinished business. The night becomes a place of restoration rather than rumination, and the soul learns that it does not have to carry the weight of the world into unconsciousness. When consciousness fades, vulnerability increases. Sleep is not simply a biological shutdown. It is a state in which the usual safeguards of awareness are lowered. The body rests, the analytical mind disengages, and the imagination becomes more active. This transition is necessary for restoration, yet it also highlights a truth we prefer to ignore. We are not self-sustaining. Before sleep, the request for protection is not a sign of fear, but an acknowledgement of design. Protection is often misunderstood as the prevention of all difficulty. In reality, it is the preservation of purpose, clarity, and peace in the midst of uncertainty. Before sleep, prayer establishes a perimeter around the inner life. It does not attempt to control every outcome, but it places boundaries around what is allowed to influence the mind and spirit during rest. The mind, especially in sleep, continues to process what it has absorbed. Dreams, impressions, and emotional residues emerge from this processing. Without intentional direction, the mind replays what it has been fed: news, conflict, fear, desire. Prayer before sleep acts as a filter. It signals what is permitted to linger and what is dismissed. This is not mystical manipulation. It is stewardship of attention. There is also the matter of anticipation. Sleep bridges today and tomorrow. What you invite into that bridge often determines the tone of what follows. Prayer that asks for protection is also prayer that invites guidance. It acknowledges that the coming day already exists beyond your sight and that preparation begins before awareness returns. Protection of the body is often the most obvious concern. Health, safety, and rest are legitimate requests. Yet protection extends further. It includes emotional stability, freedom from intrusive thoughts, and resilience against despair. These are battles rarely acknowledged but frequently fought in the quiet hours. Prayer brings them into the open without magnifying them. The request for protection over dreams is particularly significant. Dreams are not random scraps of imagination. They are shaped by what occupies the heart. When the inner life is left unattended, dreams often become restless, chaotic, or disturbing. Inviting protection over this realm is an act of trust. It is saying that even in unconsciousness, the soul remains under care. Protection also involves entrusting tomorrow to God's oversight. Anxiety about the future is a common thief of rest. The mind projects scenarios, calculates risks, and rehearses conversations that may never occur. Prayer before sleep interrupts this projection. It returns the future to its rightful owner. This does not negate planning. It prevents obsession. To invite divine protection is to accept that security is relational, not mechanical. It is not achieved by perfect habits or constant vigilance, but by placement under authority. This perspective transforms prayer from a last resort into a first defense. There is a paradox in this act. The more protection is consciously entrusted, the less it is anxiously monitored. Peace emerges not because danger has been eliminated, but because trust has been established. This peace is not fragile. It endures through uncertainty because it is rooted in confidence rather than control. Night after night, this practice reshapes the inner landscape. The mind learns to disengage without fear. The heart learns to release without panic. Rest becomes deeper, not because life is easier, but because the soul has learned where to place itself when awareness fades. Inviting protection before sleep is also an affirmation of belonging. It is the recognition that you are not isolated even in unconsciousness. This awareness counters the loneliness that often surfaces at night. You are not guarding yourself through darkness. You are being kept. When this understanding takes hold, sleep becomes an act of worship. It is the quiet confession that life continues under divine care even when you are not watching. In that confession, the soul finds rest that no amount of exhaustion can force. Sleep is often treated as a necessity of the body rather than a declaration of the soul. Yet every time you lie down and allow consciousness to fade, you are making a statement about what you believe sustains your life. You are admitting, whether consciously or not, that the world does not depend on your vigilance. This admission can feel unsettling to those who equate rest with irresponsibility, but in truth, sleep is one of the clearest expressions of trust available to a human being. To sleep is to relinquish control. You cannot monitor outcomes, manage problems, or respond to emergencies while unconscious. For those accustomed to constant engagement, this relinquishment can provoke anxiety. The mind resists letting go because it confuses awareness with influence. Prayer before sleep confronts this confusion. It reframes rest not as abandonment of duty, but as obedience to design. Trust is not the absence of concern. It is the placement of concern. When you pray before sleep, you are deciding where your concern will reside during the hours you cannot act. You are transferring responsibility from your limited capacity to an authority not bound by fatigue. This transfer is not symbolic. It shapes the quality of rest because the mind no longer carries a burden it cannot fulfill. Many experience shallow or restless sleep not because they lack exhaustion, but because they lack trust. The body lies down, but the mind remains alert, guarding imagined threats. Prayer dismantles this posture. It signals that watchfulness has been assigned elsewhere. This does not happen through force, but through acknowledgement. Trust expressed before sleep also confronts the illusion of indispensability. There is a subtle pride in believing that things will unravel if you are not constantly engaged. Night exposes the futility of this belief. The world has always functioned through cycles of rest and activity, light and darkness. You are part of that rhythm, not its master. When trust replaces self-reliance at night, rest becomes restorative rather than merely unconscious. The difference is profound. Restorative sleep renews clarity, emotional balance, and perspective. It prepares the soul to engage the coming day without desperation. This preparation begins with the decision to trust before sleep. There is also a moral dimension to trusting God with the night. It involves believing that righteousness does not require constant strain. Many carry the belief that vigilance is virtuous and rest is indulgent. Prayer before sleep challenges this distortion. It affirms that obedience includes rest and that faith is expressed not only in action, but in surrender. Trusting God with sleep also means trusting Him with outcomes. It is acknowledging that progress does not depend solely on effort. Seeds grow in darkness. Processes unfold while unseen. By sleeping, you are participating in this truth. Prayer makes this participation conscious. Over time, this practice reshapes identity. You begin to see yourself not as the center of control, but as a steward within a larger order. This shift reduces anxiety because it aligns expectation with reality. You are responsible, but not sovereign. You are engaged, but not alone. Trust before sleep also prepares the heart for disappointment and success alike. When outcomes are entrusted rather than controlled, they lose their power to define worth. The next day is received as a gift rather than a verdict. This posture fosters resilience. When sleep is approached as an act of trust, it becomes sacred rather than routine. The bed becomes an altar of sorts, where control is laid down and confidence is affirmed. This does not require elaborate language. Simple acknowledgement suffices. In this way, prayer before sleep teaches the soul a lesson repeated nightly. You are upheld even when you are not striving. The God who neither slumbers nor sleeps invites you to do precisely that. And in accepting this invitation, you discover that trust is not passive resignation, but the deepest form of rest. The way a day ends quietly shapes the way the next one begins. This is not merely a matter of mood or energy, but of orientation. Before sleep, the soul is set like a compass. What it points toward in those final moments often determines how it awakens. Night is not an interruption of purpose. It is part of its preparation. When the day is closed in faith rather than exhaustion, awakening becomes more than routine. It becomes readiness. Many wake feeling behind before the day has even begun. The mind resumes yesterday's unfinished conversations, unresolved fears, and lingering pressures. This carryover is not inevitable. It is often the result of entering sleep without intention. Prayer before sleep breaks this continuity. It draws a clear boundary between what has been and what will be. In doing so, it frees the morning from the weight of the night. Awakening with purpose does not mean waking without challenge. It means waking with clarity about where authority lies. When the night has been entrusted to God, the morning is received as assignment rather than accident. The soul does not scramble for meaning, it resumes it. Faith practiced at night has a cumulative effect on mornings. Over time, the anxiety that once greeted waking hours loses its immediacy. Problems are still recognized, but they are not personalized as threats to identity. This distinction is crucial. Purpose is not discovered by eliminating difficulty, but by engaging it from a place of alignment. Prayer before sleep also conditions the mind to expect guidance rather than chaos. When the heart has been oriented toward trust, it becomes more receptive to insight. Solutions often emerge not because they were consciously pursued overnight, but because the mind was freed from panic. This is one of the paradoxes of faith. Surrender creates space for clarity. The transition from night to morning mirrors the larger rhythm of life. Endings prepare beginnings. When endings are marked by resentment or fear, beginnings inherit confusion. When endings are marked by trust, beginnings inherit direction. This rhythm is not mystical, it is structural. Human consciousness functions through continuity. Purpose is sustained, not manufactured. It is maintained through consistent alignment rather than dramatic revelation. Prayer before sleep is one of the most effective tools for this maintenance because it occurs at the point of transition. It ensures that the self which awakens is not fragmented, but gathered. There is also an ethical dimension to awakening with purpose. When the soul is rested in trust, it is less reactive. It listens more carefully, responds more thoughtfully, and resists impulsive judgment. This is not because the person is morally superior, but because inner noise has been reduced. Purpose flourishes in clarity. Faith at night also tempers ambition. It reminds the soul that success is not the measure of worth. This perspective prevents the morning from becoming a desperate chase for validation. Instead, action flows from identity rather than insecurity. Over time, this pattern reshapes how life is approached. Days are no longer isolated struggles, but connected movements within a larger narrative. Each night's prayer becomes a hinge between chapters, closing one with gratitude and opening the next with expectation. To awaken with purpose is not to awaken with all answers. It is to awaken with confidence in the one who holds them. This confidence steadies the mind when plans change and anchors the heart when outcomes disappoint. It is a quiet strength, cultivated in stillness. The practice of closing the day in faith and opening the next in trust transforms ordinary mornings into meaningful beginnings. Alarm clocks become less jarring. Responsibilities feel less oppressive. This does not happen because life has softened, but because the soul has learned to rest in continuity rather than chaos. Before sleep, you are not only preparing to rest, you are preparing to rise. The posture you choose at night echoes into the morning. When the final act of the day is faith, the first breath of the next carries purpose.